Guten Morgen.
Good morning. I hope you've all made it here somewhat dry-ish. I'm so happy about this rain. I live in Brandenburg. It's always been a bit absurdly dusty every time the wind rises. And suddenly you can't see the horizon anymore. So for the desert of Brandenburg, this is great news. For us in the queue, it was a little bit annoying. But these are the times. Thank you, Niels, for referencing limbo. I also use the term crunch time a lot because I feel that, we feel that the old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. It doesn't want to die and it's looking for new clothes. I can agree on the digital medieval times. It makes sense to look at who's trying to push this in what direction. What are we labeling as progress, and how do we find alliances that can create a picture of the future that's large enough to encompass the many? Because that's the reason why I chose this title, Reactionary. You can see currently there's a surrender of the great promise of the 20th century from some of the most powerful people, men in the world. And that's that after 2 world wars, we said we can do it. This planet's development can be designed in a way, and we can cooperate to make that happen, that everyone has a place on it. And that's why we have universal human rights. That's why we had global institutions like the United Nations, cooperation programs, scientific cooperations that I know firsthand, that I know very well. How do we deal with climate as humanity, keep it stable? How do we deal with biodiversity, that we keep the soil fertile, that we have enough water, that it can store enough water? How do we deal with the oceans that are global commons like the other things as well? And how do we make sure that desertification doesn't progress quite as quickly as we could see right now in Brandenburg? Because then very little grows. And as biological beings, we cannot forget that with all the technological progress and the fascination about what's possible, that primarily we still have to breathe, drink, eat, or otherwise we get hungry and then sick. And that cooperation is really the moment where we feel best, where we feel seen, where we can learn from each other, where we can drive ourselves to greater heights even further. And we do that best when we know that where we're going, where we're striving towards, there should be a place for everyone. And that's why it's so dramatic that this promise to everyone is currently being dismantled. And I think this is definitely related to the planetary limits. It's the idea of how much can one person take, use for themselves in terms of houses, square meters, islands, fleets of mega yachts. At some point that will have to lead to the question, how many of us actually fit on this planet? If this one footprint is gigantic, then of course fewer people fit on that planet than if we ask ourselves, okay, so what's enough? What's enough to live comfortably? And we can see that the footprint of of Donald Trump and his tech bros is so big that they also want to stomp over on Greenland, Canada, Mexico, maybe just rename things, declare it's part of territory that we have access to, that we have rights on, because it's not about having a place for everyone, but about the privileged elevating themselves over the few. And worst comes to worst, we just go to Mars. And it's important to name the patterns that we see here, because we see reactionary. I want to dive deep into that. It's an open term, stimulus and response. So there's a consequence to each action, as we can see in our day-to-day. Depending on how we act, people react differently, different things happen. But we've heard that the reason is that the side that wants more diversity, more environmental protections, more participation, that they've overdone it. And that's why it would be almost normal that the pendulum swings back now. And that makes me a bit sad that I hear this also from German sociologists and philosophers. Now you see you've pushed it too far. It was clear that there had to be a response or a reaction. I think there's a moment where we have to think about, and I want to do that in the second part of this talk, that maybe from a movement that's opening up towards diversity, towards plurality, how do we talk to each other? How can we make sure everyone can be seen? How can we make sure that the half of the world's population that's primarily doing care work and not included as much in professional contexts, what can we do for them? Now instead it should go back, it should be reactionary, it should go back to the way it was. And now we have manly, efficient teams, like Mark Zuckerberg called it. And so it's important to ask, what is this stimulus-response thing? Who's stimulating, who's responding, who's acting? And if you maybe overdo it, it legitimizes a certain kind of reaction, and when is it an overreaction or even an attack? And I think that's important because otherwise we often come into this point of making perpetrate a reversal, and you don't have to act like maybe Donald Trump did towards Zelensky and then also say, well, it was his fault. That's a complete farce. It's a complete overreaction. It's a demotion and a humiliation that has only one goal, namely to prevent a reaction because people are scared. So in this time of limbo, we have to look at who's trying to influence whom and what. And this is Montesquieu. He wrote that down very calmly. He said, okay, in politics, everything is that way. Every action will lead to a reaction. He didn't say you have to be angry, you have to react angrily. I think it's always interesting. I'm usually trying to gender when I give my talks, and sometimes I don't make it very well, but often well-meaning older men came to me and said, Ms. Göpel, just don't make it so hard on yourselves. You know, gendering, that triggers people, it annoys people. Stefan Mau wrote about it. It's just leads to these reactions. And I said, oh, that's very interesting, that you've decided that this reaction happens in your brain, but Mr. Mau didn't write that there is an instant response between your ear and the anger cells in your brain. He only observed that these trigger points do lead more and more to these angry reactions, but there's no neural link here. It's an emotional reaction and a decision. And that's why it's so important to always ask ourselves, okay, where do we say something is an automatism? They went overboard, so we had to respond in kind and force, or maybe give a friendly response. And we use this mechanism to balance something. If we feel that things are running away, things are escalating. And I think that's what's interesting about complex systems, that we always have this homeostasis that we reach, and we have a stimulus that comes in, and then we have a control center, a control loop that can decide, okay, so what does the reaction look like? How irritated are we? And then what do I do with that? To maybe regain homeostasis, to change something. And then we have the possibility to give positive feedback mechanism, to use a positive feedback mechanism, which is strengthening the response or balancing one. And in many areas we know that there are tipping points where we need to focus on the balance, because otherwise the homeostasis will be destroyed. So climate is a good example. We release more and more CO2, and we need to control that to get back to the balance. The same thing about conflicts. I don't know if you've ever done a couples therapy. It's a crazy experience. I like the ones that work systemically, because they say, okay, stop shouting at each other. Look at the patterns that you go into, the patterns that drive you crazy. And these are the feedback mechanisms where we know, okay, this is your trigger. I can push it or I cannot push it. And of course, I can stop gendering in my talks if I have older men in my audience. I can also do it very friendly and say, well, just get through it. Just 30 minutes, and then I'm happy to explain the scientific studies behind it to you. And I did that during our cocktails, and there's usually some sort of interest there, because there's a reason it was not affected. But how do we start to change the standard if otherwise a part of society just doesn't happen in the perception anymore? If we just talk about doctors gendered and in gendered languages, that will only lead to people thinking of male doctors. But we want to be more flexible, and a balancing feedback mechanism for a system that's been discriminatively controlled would be extremely useful. And I think that's good to point out today, that progress always goes along with something that adds possibilities, that opens us up. And the reactionary is something that's narrowing, closing, makes things less possible or fewer things possible. And even if we label a technological revolution, I think we can still trace it very well if we have these two central questions that we need to keep in mind. First is, where is progress? So where are we going? Don't we have a shared goal that is stabilizing, the opening, the newfound homeostasis through maybe also treating the planet well, but also each other, finding back to cooperation? Isn't that something we can agree on, that more of that is an indicator of progress? And then, of course, who can provoke, who can react? Because that's not equally distributed in society. Because in every way, we've built a system where some are more privileged than others, and that's normal for us. We can deal with that constructively, and we can say, okay, how can we keep changing little things to make more and more space? And for me, that was the central promise of the 20th century and the central promise of the sustainability agenda. And it's also the central promise that we have in our democracies and liberal value systems. This is Article 3 of the German Constitution, that everybody is the same in front of the law. It says explicitly men and women, and then that nobody can be discriminated against due to their gender, their ethnicity, language, or religion. And we can see in Germany, in a specific party, or in the US with the president, that this is not, doesn't hold anymore. But instead that only those people get rights and laws that are loyal to him, those that we approve of, that fit the system that we built. They are accepted, and they're more equal than others. And that's what we have at the moment, and it's definitely not progressive, even if it is a reaction to, hey, we're going to take these goals seriously, and that means we have to adapt a few privileges to make more room for others. And I don't have to go completely crazy if other people get rights that I have enjoyed myself for a long time.
And it's the same thing. It's not woke or weird or out there. Like when you think about what's being attacked right now with the term woke, it's about climate research, oceanic research, research on what that means for biodiversity. So, for example, there's this quote-unquote big, beautiful bill by Donald Trump where he wants to give up wildlife and nature refuge areas. And so if you say that's woke, to cancel those research contracts and to not let students research in those directions, then that's not progress, that's not opening, that's reactionary, that's closing off, that's authoritarian. And so it's very important to look how we can keep that. We're fighting these institutional ways, and people can still participate. But what's being told to us is, well, this doesn't apply to you, right? So just keep quiet. And of course, Trump goes, well, the real Americans, they won't suffer from that. But surprise, of course, they will suffer from the consequences of these actions. And so this, well, yeah, that doesn't apply to me. I'm going to be silent. That's not a great reaction. Because that's another thing that Montesquieu came up with, the division of powers. And so he said that in order to have this openness, we need to split up the power of the state, because these different instances will keep the balance, of who can cause a stimulus, who can react, and keep them from closing off. And that's what we see right now. The legislative, judicative, and executive branches, we can see that in sped up, basically, in the US. They all go up into presidential power. They do attacks on judges. They threaten judges. And there was also a tweet by the German right-wing extremist Björn Höcke when his right-wing party, the AfD, was termed a secured right-wing. And he said, well, think about it. If you joined in with that, then you're responsible and might be judged for it as well. And so there's lots and lots of threats going around. And all these possibilities of progress, I think we need new constellations of people who want to try to create something new, something beautiful, and they try to prevent that, and that's not progress. That's regress. That's regression. And so we need to be careful. Where's power being accumulated? Like libertarian, what does that even mean? Like a libertarian state, it doesn't have to regulate the market in any way. And of course, that sounds great, but of course, on a market where we have these power concentrations in few companies in each industry. So this data is from 2009. It's the concentration of power over agricultural products. And so I think we need markets, to free us from this concentration of power that we experience right now, where we can actually have entrepreneurs participating in a free market, and not just, expect dividends from those powerful companies that we have right now. And so that's the case everywhere, right? And of course, here at Republica, the Digital Society, these numbers, the usage numbers of Meta. And it was yesterday when Meta was like, I'm going to train my AI on your data. And we're not going to tell you how it works exactly, but the top 10 most used social networks, 4 of them are owned by Meta. And so who owns our social infrastructure and curates what we talk about and chooses what sort of language we can use to communicate, and if hate is being allowed or not, if hate speech is possible on these platforms. And I think it's great that we have this concept in Germany of public broadcasting, where not just capital and monetary interest go into decisions, but also the common good. And so we see how hard it is to get back into such a system. Those are shares, and especially big tech, they keep going up, right? And who causes these stimuli? Who can react to that? Who can pressure the European Union, who's one of the only instances who can resist that? And if we have the top 10 companies, and they have 35% of the value of global shares in the S&P 500, then that's farcical. And that's what's being coined libertarian. And so it's very important to say, well, you know, they have the same prefixes, liberal, libertarian, but it doesn't have to do anything with freedom. And we need different structural prerequisites for that. And so how do we get to these? If dictatorship is the concentration of power, then freedom, this common value of, it consists in its diffusion, in plurality, in democracy, in markets that offer level playing field, where we can have innovations, where multiple people can participate freely. And so woke, this came from those people who were like, well, we can see through this discrimination that's like in part of our everyday life. And so we want to, we can see it's not open, it's not free for many people, or has never been. And that we can have progress when we actually change that. And so there's 3 measures that I think are important. And the one thing is, who do we pay our attention to? Attention, I think, is quite nice if we think of it as time times intention. So we all have a certain amount of time each day. And the intention to make a difference someplace is also a decision that we can make. And so do we want to spend all of our time on Donald Trump and all these nutcases who try to provoke us all the time? Like, they can do that, they can do that. Do we just want to, like, you know, focus on that stuff that's happening, on these taboos being broken, on these big, beautiful bills and what they write in that? And not look at what laws are being rewritten in the background? Steve Bannon called this flood the zone with shit. And we're not good at dealing with that in our media spaces when we're doom scrolling, like, take this from them. And what they need is our attention. Look someplace else where people act differently, where people work on solutions and fight for what we want as a democratic space for all of us. Because what they want is to draw our attention, to bind it, and to prevent other people from participating. Algorithms, bots that act as everyone has gone mad, that of course leads to this negative spiral and negative press. And people just give up. So we feel like, well, people, they don't want migration, they don't want climate change, but it's of course this attention that was pushed by these people that try to prevent progressive goals, that try to set an agenda and try to polarize. And so, for example, in a German TV show, they showed like how it works, right? You have these talk shows on TV, you have tabloids and journals, and it's like this spiral, and the other stuff just gets lost. So please talk to people directly. It's very important. We need to strengthen that and go into the discourse and request that attention actually goes on where we want it to go, and that politics also looks someplace else and not just on this bad attention spiral. And so some self-criticism. Did we overdo it? Well, I think we have to be careful when we open up something that we need to stay open. Something needs to remain open. And sometimes I was, had discussions where I was like, well, maybe I don't use gender equal language all the time. Or someone felt discriminated against, or this happens within the progressive movement. And also in the other direction, that like, oh, you didn't do it 100% right. And so, of course, we know what happens when we, do that. It's even though we're for openness, we're closing off. We become rigid, and we have this reactionary momentum because I feel like, well, I have the only true answer, and that's not very open. That's not very friendly. That's not seeking out. It's not balancing. and it's an attack spot. It's a weak spot where people can just say, well, then we can just give up, right? We can't. I had this image of like, old men sitting around puffing their cigars, and they're like, well, we don't have to do anything. Look, because they're just like, they can't organize. They're infighting all the time. And so we have to look for this permissive momentum that we actually keep that up. Like, well, come on, I'm going to tell you why that's sort of not great what you just said. And to keep this openness, and instead of just being like, well, choose position A or position B. That's not how we're going to win, because our power of plurality, of diversity, it can only draw from a plurality, because we can never have this singular concentration of power as the other side has. And so be kind to each other, look for similarities, and think about how we can seek out what binds us together, what unites us. And of course, think about that people who don't want to take part in this progressive movement, what causes their reactionaries? Like, do they just imitate their peers, right? Because when you're an old man sitting next to other old men, then maybe you have to be like, oh, what does that young woman talk about? But actually, this cognitive bias, if we can see that, then we can open up a discourse, a dialogue. And so I can act against that, and I can try to hold out. And that doesn't mean just stand there and take it. But yeah, like there are people like who don't want to say yes, but, and instead you should just say yes, and. But it's time for yes, but. Yes, we see what you're doing. Yes, we see what terms you're using. Yes, we see what rights you're trying to turn back. And we're trying to hold against it. And we're inviting everyone who want to live without fear and in cooperation for a world where everyone can find their place.
That's the liberal society, that's the learning society, the innovative society, and that's the society where you're actually happy to participate, but only if those that are currently checking out also participate. And if you don't like Vogue, there is another great value that comes from a different corner of society, and I think it means something similar. Everybody knows what it means to be decent, look where we're going, where we want to go, and who we want to be. And that everybody knows that for some it's easier to get the attention or the rewards and the feedback from a system of education or a society than others, even though we have it certain in our constitution. So if you want to think more about what structures we can change in order to change society. So if we can look at politics, at economics, then I recommend you read my book. It's about values. We're currently rehabilitating a lot of political ideas that we kind of indecently treated in the past. And now we're getting back to that. We can create a political framework that leads us to our shared goals. We just have to be honest with ourselves to what effect they have, where they lead us. So we need to be decent, we need to look ahead, we need to be progressive, we need to participate in debates. And how we need to participate if we really wanted to reach these goals. And that's how we can identify our commonalities and also the courage to do it. Thank you very much.